Okay, let's move to the next reading, which is reading 11. This reading is quite interesting, and a lot of questions are there. When I was practicing, I saw a lot of questions from this reading, but I'm not going to cover the entire reading in detail because most of it is a very common sense, like the liquidity premium for real estate or the build-up approach for equity. I'm going to cover the formulas part and break down the formulas for ease of understanding. So the first is basically forecasting the fixed income returns in future. So one method to do this is the discounted cash flow method, which is very well known. So over here there is a not a rule but kind of a condition written for easy understanding that if the investment horizon of the investor is less than the macular duration, then capital gain loss has more impact than reinvestment risk. So what they're actually trying to say is very simple in that sense. If your investment horizon is say 2 years and your macular duration is 2.7, so what is duration? Duration is your interest rate risk. So if your investment horizon is your less than your duration, that means you are more prone to have a capital gain loss, or your returns will be impacted more by the capital gain loss rather than the reinvestment risk. Because if your investment horizon is less than the duration, then if your maturity is happening here, you can still invest for zero point 0.7 duration in the bond with a very low interest rate risk, because your investment horizon is less than the duration of the bond or the macular duration of the portfolio in that sense. And if the horizon is greater, so if your horizon is greater than the duration, obviously now you are open to the interest rate risk, because the duration is the interest rate risk is covered up only up to 1.5. Once that horizon is crossed, you are exposed to the changes in the interest rate which can happen. So if the horizon is greater than the duration, then the reinvestment risk is more dominant, because now you might end up in a situation where the yields are so low that you don't wish to invest in those bonds. Quite simple. Then emerging bond risk. What are some signs of risk in emerging market? These have been asked in most of the mock questions. So just trying to understand it. So from an understanding that what kind of risk premiums are added for emerging markets. So one is obviously the term premium, which is the higher the tenure of the bond, the more the more riskier the bond becomes. Credit premium, obviously emerging markets like India, Brazil, Russia, China. These markets they are very risky, not risky in the sense, but they are not developed markets. They are developing markets, so they attract a good amount of credit premium. And obviously liquidity premium, because these if you compare Indian bond market with the US bond market, the Indian bond market is not even 1/10 of the US bond market. So in that sense, there is a very less liquidity in emerging markets, because those currencies are not favored by the global investors. So that is why the bonds are very less traded, and there is a liquidity premium. Quite straightforward. So the entire base of this chapter is on these premiums only, but it's written in a complicated language. So some signs that the emerging bond risk is wealth concentration. So like if the top billionaires or top millionaires are having the wealth, and there are very few companies which are employing most of the employees of the nation, then this is a sign of a emerging bond market risk. Cyclical commodity heavy economy, like it is very much dependent on the commodity prices, and it's cyclical in nature. The government applies restrictive capital flows and inadequate fiscal and monetary policy. So you must have seen yesterday only there is some problem going on in Sri Lanka because of the fall of reserves. And now this fall of reserves have happened because the government has not taken proper fiscal and monetary actions when it was required, and now they are in a position of not even paying up their short term debts in foreign currencies. Poor workforce, technology, and infra. So yes, population can be an asset and a liability also. So if you have a very high population, say someone like China, but if they are not skilled, then they will become a liability to the nation. So one reason why China is quite ahead, because their workforce is quite skilled, and a poor workforce will become a liability on a country. Technology and infra is self-explanatory. A huge foreign currency debt with low reserves, right? Now, why do countries keep reserves? It's basically to pay off the foreign currency debt and just to protect the local currency value. So if you have a huge foreign currency debt, someone like Pakistan having very low reserves but a huge foreign currency debt, so that bond becomes very riskier. The sovereign bonds also become riskier. A less developed financial markets is basically in that markets external external investors or foreign institutional investors presence is very low, and those markets are governed by the local bodies and favoring the local bodies, not really integrated with the global markets. These are some warning signs mentioned, not really a rule, but yeah, that's just mentioned that if your foreign currency debt is greater than 50% of the GDP and overall debt is greater than 200% of your current accounts receipts, then it's a warning sign. So for the exam, it's important to remember only this part. This is very much testable, all these 4 points. I think so most of the other points are quite self-explanatory, and even in the exam it's asked, I think so most of us will be able to answer it. Then we come to the forecasting of equity returns. So, like we had the DCF approach in all our level one, level two, when we use the GGM or the Gordon growth model. We have a Grenoble Kroner model over here, wherein the returns of the equity are dependent on three factors. One is the dividend yield, which is D by P. Dividend yield is basically the dividend divided by the current price, plus change in earnings, which is EPS, minus change in shares which are outstanding or floated in the market, which are available for trading. So change in EPS minus change in the outstanding shares plus change in the price to equity ratio, right? So if you just break down this thing, what is dividend? Dividend is a cash flow and it's an income, dividend yield, right? So the first part is dividend income minus shares outstanding, because you will get dividend only on the shares which are outstanding in the market. So dividend yield minus the change in shares of outstanding is your cash flow or income returns. Nominal earning growth return is real plus inflation is equal to change in earnings. So a lot of time in the questions you will see that okay, the real return for the equity market is this and this is the inflation. Then what is the expected return? So when you're computing this expected return and you're coming to the earnings part, you have to add the real return of the equity plus the inflation to get the nominal. So the formula is simple: n is equal to I plus R, where n is the nominal return, is inflation plus real rate of return, and repricing return is basically the change in PE. So that's quite explanatory. So this model is testable. It's been asked in most of the questions and in the practice questions also. It's quite simple. It's in the sense dividend yield. Again, just to change EPS minus change in outstanding plus change in PE. Okay, and then we move on to the shortcomings of this model. So shortcoming of this model is that a stock cannot have an ever increasing PE, obviously, and model doesn't take investor horizon into consideration. So in the long run, change in PE is close to zero. So this is counterintuitive. Basically, this model is assuming that the stock return is always dependent on the change in PE, but the change in PE cannot go infinite. Right now, if a stock has a price, price per share of say 10 rupees, and it has an earning per share of say suppose 1 rupee, it's already at 10x, right? Now it cannot happen, or no, it cannot happen indefinitely that the stock price is at 1000, example, and its EPS is at 1, so it's trading at 1000x valuation, which is really not possible in the real world, because somewhere somehow the valuations will kick in and the prices will go down. So that's the statement which the author is making over there, that this is the shortcoming of this model, because it is including a term which is in longer term the change in PA is close to zero, because the shares price adjust, the earnings adjust, and in the longer term you cannot have a constantly increasing P. So one of the most testable material is this Singer-Terhar method, which is a risk premium or the build-up approach. Over here, it is taking the CAPM approach, which is the risk-free rate plus beta plus the market risk premium. This RI is basically RI is the risk premium of the portfolio. And over here, beta is basically the systematic risk of the asset tied to the global market. So that we all know, that's a definition of beta. It is the sensitivity of the stock to the global market. Now this is the formula over here, that Ri is equal to this risk-free rate plus beta of the asset vis-a-vis the market, and multiplied by the market risk premium, where Rm is the market return and Rf is the risk-free return. Now we know that the beta of the asset can be written as a covariance of that asset with the market divided by the variance of that returns of the market. So this is the formula for beta, which we can really break down. And if we further break down, we get this formula, which is correlation of your asset I with the market multiplied by standard deviation of your asset divided by the standard deviation of the market. So this is a formula is given in the book. So if you see in real sense, what's happening over here is the base formula is Ri is equal to Rf plus beta risk premium. Now this beta is written as this formula, covariance of that asset divided by the variance of the market. Now covariance upon variance will give you the correlation of that asset with the market multiplied by standard deviation of the asset. So this is the formula, and the standard deviation of the market is obviously coming from the variance part. Now once you put all this into the original formula Ri, then Ri becomes correlation of asset I into M from here, standard deviation of I from here, standard deviation of market from here, and Rm minus Rf, which is the risk premium approach, which is the risk premium from the CAPM. Now if you see only this term, this is the Sharpe ratio of the market, right? It's a risk return of the market minus risk-free return upon standard deviation of the returns of the market. So in the exam, it might also be mentioned as the Sharpe ratio. Only the Sharpe ratio might be given, and we'll have to compute the asset premium. So over here we have to remember that this is nothing but the Sharpe ratio, and correlation of the asset to the market and standard deviation of the asset is basically derived from this formula, that is covariance upon variance. And this is how you compute the risk premium. Ri is the risk premium of the portfolio, the global equity portfolio. So this is a very important model, and it is very much testable. So I'm not covering the other parts. I will cover the reading 13, which is asset allocation, in the next chapter. But yeah, from the book, what I think is these are the major things to understand. Yeah, but one more thing that I've not covered as part of the slide, but I'll just cover over here. See, in the Singer-Tehar model, there are two approaches. One is the CAPM thing that we have already discussed, and then there is a concept of integration and segregation. So when we say integration and segregation, is basically how integrated is this portfolio to the world market. So suppose the US market is very much integrated with the world market or the global assets. But if you take a third party country, maybe just take Sri Lanka for that matter, it is quite segregated with the global market. So the obviously the correlation of the assets will be different in this market and when we talk about this market. So if the market is very well integrated, that degree of integration is multiplied in this formula, and if the market is segregated, the degree of integration is not used because obviously there is no integration, so it will assume no integration over here. So there are some examples in the book which you can easily understand, and it's quite self-explanatory. But yeah, the major concern that most of the people have, they don't remember this formula. The easiest way to do is to arrive at this from a CAPM. That's very much most of our part of the CFA journey. Then basically the formula for any beta is basically the covariance upon variance of that asset vis-a-vis the market. This is the formula for beta, generic formula. Even if you do it in Excel, it will give you the same result. So from there, from your covariance and variance, you can arrive at the correlation formula, which we have done in all our levels, and just put this back into the original formula, which is the beta. It's replaced by the correlation of the asset into standard deviation, and the Rm minus Rf part, which is coming from here, is the market Sharpe ratio. Remember, this is the risk premium, not the return. Thank you.